Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another video. In this video, I will be performing a psychoanalysis specifically on guilt. And in order to understand guilt, we have to basically pick apart the guiltiest moment in human history, which was the crucifixion of Christ. In the crucifixion of Christ came the notion for mankind and their mentality anyways, that upon the crucifixion of this individual, upon the punishment of one particular individual, that the whole of the society could do to that one particular individual, you then see that the guilt of the actual world's sins, that which were carried by Christ, the essential world sins went from they could do it to Christ, but if Christ were to do it to them, he would be seen as evil. And in that notion, we see the split in the guilt. In the analyzing of guilt, we have to first step into the stemming emotion that which guilt stems from. And there's two primary emotions that all other emotions stem from, which is love and fear. Based off of love and fear, we base our human understanding and our human connection to one another as people is based around these two connective energies or emotions, love and fear. Now, when you derive guilt as a result of the initial input of fear, which is, say, something as fearing somebody for simply being different than you. And so out of the fear began the neuroticism, which is, if that person can have that, why can't I? And in the act of jealousy, we then dive into the first spectrum of what is known as guilt. You see, jealousy and guilt all are part of the same spectrum, as is just simply the range at which you feel the emotion. Because out of jealousy, you could say you're going to develop a more intense feeling of guilt according to how you choose to act going forward. Now, in the actual psychoanalysis of the guilt of the crucifixion of Christ itself, well, for one, you could look at the guilt of the punishers, because there's separate people in the crucifixion of Christ, at which we must now analyze the evolution of their pathology, that which we can see in their lineage as nations. In terms of the separate people that experience guilt, you might see the first one in Judah. In Judas, his guilt is as a result of being the accuser, which means in being the accuser, he is an individual that has specifically pointed the finger and said to that particular accused individual, because of your difference, I accuse you of so-and-so. Which now, when we realize that the story of Christ was actually based around the fact that the arrest of Christ was built around the fact that he had burnt down a church. Because Christ did not see that you should have to pay in order for you to experience faith, which the symbolism reflects in a deeper resonance as I progress in the video. Now, from the accuser, you then enter the guilt of those that went to make the arrest, where you then see that even in the story, I believe it was Peter that ended up cutting the ear off of one of the arresters. And even in the moments of his arrest, when Jesus is about to be taken into custody, even in the moments of his arrest, Jesus still takes time out of his day in the midst of his arrest to magically heal the severed ear off of the arrester's head. So then we see the second layer of guilt. The first one being based on making an accusation, an assumption. The second guilt is regarding your ability to listen. Then when we dive into the next guilt, we then see the guilt of those that would torture him. And in the guilt of those that would torture him, you would then see that no matter how much they would increase the level of torture, Jesus would still not require he would not tap out, essentially. No matter how brutal the punishment was, Jesus would not tap out, which invites a notion of resilience, which in a resilient punishment, imagine if the person that you are punishing continuously, in their resilience, almost develops a likeness to their punishment. And in that resilience, you develop a severe guilt now as their torturer, because you're realizing you've created an individual that is thriving on punishment. And in that resilience, in the guilt that you see that the target you are punishing is resilient, you actively feel now as the torturer guilt, because they're not tapping out and you're enjoying continuing. And now you begin to question, is it the fact that they themselves are sick for enjoying or not tapping out? Or are you the one that's sick for increasing the level at which you're generating the punishment at? And then we get further and further and further and further into the analysis, where you begin to see each and every individual that which Christ greets upon his carrying of the cross. Which, now when you look at the actual act of carrying the cross, imagine if you were meant to carry a burden in your life that only you could carry, and everyone around you was fighting themselves off to carry the burden only you are meant to carry. And now in the jealousy that they wish they could carry that burden just as you, in the jealousy that which they wish they could carry that burden, they place the initial accusation, which is where they place their hatred upon you. And in the placement of the hatred they have, because they could not have the burden you were able to carry, based on that hatred, you are then punished. And not just lightly punished, based on the guilt from the jealousy that is building this momentum of guilt now. based on the initial input of hatred, you can actively see the progression of the level of guilt that humanity feels in the story of Christ at every particular individual, that from the moment of Christ's arrest or his accusation in Judas, when you read the story, you can actively see that each particular individual that is greeted by Christ or is mentioned in the story leading to the very crucifixion itself is an act of developing the momentum at which the guilt is felt, which is where we arrive now at the root core of faith, which is derived in the guilt. If you wish to feel the true weight of faith, then I would suggest you look at it from this perspective. You see, back in the very first tale regarding why Christ was arrested, Christ was arrested for burning a church down because he specifically believed that you should not have to pay to pray, which meant you should not have to pay or pay a price in exchange for feeling a connection with the Creator, which was a paradox in its own, if you wish, because now when you look at the actual fundamental meaning of the entire story, that which is the story of Christ, which is built around generating the momentum of guilt until we get to the final point of the crucifixion, which now we see Christ dies for humanity's sins, which means all of human guilt, from very minor to very extreme levels of guilt, were all laid upon that particular individual based on the level of sickness that the society had at that particular time in their twisted or warpedness of the mind. Now, in the notion of guilt and in the notion that you should not have to pay a price in order for you to feel your connection with the Creator, came the paradox. Because see, the ultimate price that created the faith or the strength behind the faith built around Christ revolves around a particular light or a flame, which in itself is the guilt. And in according to the level at which this flame burns, according to the level of guilt you feel coursing or burning your soul away, according to that level of guilt, you would then see in the direction that which you would see your salvation, which is the core transmutation of guilt and turning it into something else. And then the idea of salvation is the idea of once again being able to move forward a next step, to reuse the previous energy to salvage, to reuse what was previously there, and make something anew out of it, a salvation. Which now when you look at the particular story or the religions derived specifically around the story of Christ, which are Catholicism and Christianity, when you look at the direction, you could see now from the guilt that which you could essentially harvest as a human, as if you are a farmer of guilt at that particular point. And the more you cultivated this guilt, the more you could transmute it into a salvation of sorts, either that in your suffering you may then change your guilt, and then the final transmutation was the transmutation of Catholicism, which is the idea that in your suffering is where you find your salvation, and you transmute it into Christianity, which is in your rebirth is where you find your salvation. And in the rebirth of these two separate religions, if you wish, you then see the perspective at which guilt is used to generate faith. It is the token or the price at which you must pay in order for you to feel a connection with the Creator. And if you do not believe me, then I would suggest you analyze your own internal state of affairs, because if you do not fear the idea of going to hell based on the level of guilt you have cultivated, then I would suggest you might have a slight psychopathic nature and a moral compass disorder. In the idea that now we see that humans actively cultivate, as in gather. The more you can hoard it, the more you can spend it. And you might say, well, this sounds sick and twisted and evil. And yet, in the holiest of matters, where you see good-hearted Christian people or good-hearted Catholic people, you then see that even in themselves, you would see that they are not afraid or are specifically ignorant to the evil they commit, which means they are ignorant to the fear they generate in the world, which means they are ignorant to the level of guilt they generate within the world. Which in itself, this guilt, in the act of spreading the word of God, one generates guilt in others. And in the act of spreading the word of God and generating guilt in others, we once again see the symbol of Christ, which is the moment an individual shares the word of God, and in the building of the guilt of those he shares the word of God with, or she shares the word of God with, you then see the beginning of the story of Christ once again, which is the building momentum at which the world would build the level of guilt they could generate and cultivate as a world based on one particular individual. And you might say this sounds like a sick and evil and twisted way of looking at Christianity and Catholicism, or just a sick and twisted way of looking at the story of Christ. But what do you think that story is? It is a sick and twisted story. which derived faith around it. And so now when you look further into the analysis, and you see that in the cultivation of guilt is where you see the transmutation. From one energy, I can make it something else, creating a faith. From one opposite feeling, I can take this energy and transmute it into a different state, which now you arrive before the angel Michael, which through your life, in your moments of cultivating guilt that you yourself don't feel upon yourself, but you cultivate it in the level of guilt or suffering that others feel in their lives. And in the cultivating that which the rate others feel suffering in their lives, you begin cultivating what is known as guilt, which you yourself don't experience. Hence, why are you doing this to Christ at that particular point? Because if you truly did not feel guilt, you would not be doing these particular actions. And in the understanding of the story of Christ, we then begin to see that it was actually in the darkness that you must first make conscious, where you then may see a transmutation of, once darkness is conscious, it becomes illuminated, and it transmutes into a light. And from this light, you can see where you as a sinner can experience your character arc beyond the flooding of your tears, which is the moment you are meant to experience a rebirth, where you actively choose to say, I will no longer be that man going forward. This is the beauty of that particular faith. In the understanding that the guilt is what generated the faith, or the ability to transmute what is known as faith. The ability to take one particular negative emotion and to transmute it into a rebirth, where you now change the patterns at which you actively step into the trajectory of your life. In the negative patterns of the trajectory, we then see once again the arisement of fear, which in the fear we are allowing the world to punish Christ, which is in the fear we first see the cultivation of guilt. And then we further see that it is actually Christ that is the one that suffers, and it is Christ that develops this guilt, which from one particular individual, was the cultivation of guilt, also known as faith. From one particular individual, they were able to essentially harvest so much guilt out of it that they were able to generate faith for billions of people. Where do we see this type of practice? You could say it is as a pagan ritual, a pagan sacrificial ritual. which when you analyze the true nature behind Roman Catholicism, you would then see that in the rise of the Roman Catholic Church, you could see similarities develop once again within the pagan and Roman Catholic Church, which is the idea of creating a sacrifice to punish one particular individual to cultivate what is known as faith or guilt. Now the problem is, if you think that that sounds like a good idea, then I would argue that you yourself are a psychopath in nature, and you might be hidden within the world now because you have just become aware that you yourself are a psychopathic serial killer if you have the ability to see why the reasoning behind that is a valid reason. Which in that particular statement you could say then, if you agree with that particular valor, well then you would see the current valor represented in today's world. Hence why you see that as an acceptable valor. And so now in my psychoanalysis, I would like to place a rather sickness to the claim of this valor, because if one particular individual must suffer for the rest, then I would argue that we have officially discovered what true Marxism is, which is that one individual must work and suffer so the rest may live completely free, without taking responsibility. And in the Marxist idea, you then begin to see how the biblical story could have been retold throughout the eras in order to warp our perception of how we should be looking at the story of Christ. Because in my analysis of breaking down not just Marxism, but the very basis of what is known as guilt, which in order to understand guilt, you must look at the guiltiest moment in human history, which is the moment Christ is present on earth. In the act of Christ being present on earth, imagine now if you were to be speaking of God, you as the individual sharing the wisdom are generating and cultivating the guilt in others so that they themselves may experience the entire process of this faith within themselves, so that they themselves may arise to a water from which they may never thirst again, so that they themselves may enter heaven. And in the fear of that particular statement, those that chose to say, I choose not to drink from that water because I am afraid of that water, because I am afraid of accepting God into my life. And the moment you see that there is a fear of the generation of the transmutation, which stems from one individual cultivating the fear so that all others may experience that particular divine holy water so that they themselves may never thirst again, we then change a perspective where the cultivation of fear was from everyone put onto one particular sun, where through everyone it was now the one particular son and only the son that would get to drink from this water which you may never thirst again from. Because in the fear is the inability to accept or invite an idea into your life. because we as humans only think based on what is physical. We cannot comprehend an understanding of something that which we do not process through the experience of our five senses, which process physical reality, but we have a mental reality. And so now you see the rise of Christ being an individual which speaks of understanding what reality within the mind might look like, which is a process of analysis. You might now see where the levels of guilt you feel in yourself. You feel a weightlessness and a weight attached just the same. Yet guilt is not a physical property, yet it carries a weight, an atomic mass of sorts, a charging state, which densifies the weight of your molecules of your body. You can literally feel it weigh inside your body according to which molecules have been charged by this guilt. And so now you might say, well, how can you charge molecules? That is what is known as atomic mass, which atomic mass is the amount of energy you are intaking within a cell. And at the mitochondrial level, you then see the increase in atomic mass, or the densifying state, resulting in matter taking a more denser or heavier form. And you might ask, well, what is the densest object in the universe? To which it would be a black hole. Which through a black hole you can actively regenerate the universe. But the second densest object in the universe is the sun, known as the neutron star. The first division of light from the darkness. From the black hole, from the darkness, you emit the initial first heaviest object, a neutron star, which in itself is so heavy it pulls and affects the gravitational field you could consider the crust of Earth you walk upon, which in itself, this gravitational field creates a downward pull. And in order to know whom the Son is, whom Christ is, well, you could say you would be able to perceive whom Christ is according to if they have the ability to make the earth shake when they walk based on their atomic mass. Which means you can generate a change in the Earth's gravitational field, known as the Earth's crust. Where imagine now if you have a heavy enough atomic mass, known as charged suffering, within your cells, you would then see that in the heaviness or the depression of your cells, where you compress your cell's density, in the depression of things itself, the atomic mass of an individual can feel so heavy that even at every step they begin developing what is known as a vertigo, which they feel as though the Earth's crust is bouncing underneath their feet. But then it comes to one particular individual which makes the entire world shake based on the amount of fear they have struck or cultivated in the entire world. And now, out of fear, the entire world is seeking to cultivate all of that particular fear and cultivate it back for the world. And now you see this infinite repetition of who controls the guilt. And now you might say, well, in the understanding that Christ was God's Son, you could actively then say that he who controls the guilt is he who is God. Because from the guilt controlling, you can control where the faith is spent in people. And you can actively see how this faith is spent according to the seeds you plant in people. Because from these seeds, you can actively create new thought patterns in the tree of knowledge of the nervous system of people. And through these new thought patterns, you can generate healing patterns where you see character arcs, rebirths, and in the guilt or the price that which you must now have to pay in order to experience faith. Once again, we see a miracle of Christ known as healing. Thank you.